Welcome to the
Club Dub Football Podcast,
where the only question is,
does your team make it into the club?
Can he get in? No, he cannot!
Welcome to the Club Dub Football Podcast. Through the season, our NFL podcast will take you through the slate of games each week. And as we talk through each tie, we'll be discussing who we think will be heading home and who will be grabbing a W and heading on victorious to Club Dub. As well as us talking through the likely winners and losers, we'll also take you to the storylines and superstars on each sideline and get you up to speed with everything you need to know for the games ahead. You can get involved too. Send your questions, predictions and more to us via email at clubdubpodcast@mail.com, or you can find and follow us on Twitter at clubdubpodcast. I'm Rob Rose, and I'm going to be joined by James Aldrin, James Bushby and Philip Bushby to talk through the ties for this week's wildcard round of the NFL playoffs. And thank you for joining us for our inaugural podcast. Let's get things going. It's cold outside, but the games are hotting up. Came up with that one all on my own. And to kick us off, I'm going to throw over to you, Aldrin, for your game of the week.
So I'm picking Colts versus Bills this week, and it's going to be an interesting one. Obviously, the Colts kind of snuck into the playoffs courtesy of a Miami loss, and it was to the Bills. And I think it's going to be an interesting matchup. It's kind of a game of offense versus defense, really. I think the key to this matchup is going to be, of course, the performance of Josh Allen, but also I think the Darius Leonard-led defense of the Colts, and can they stand up to what is a really potent Bills offense? And I think Stephon Diggs is really the player to watch. I think he's come on a hell of a lot this year and showcased why the Bills were so keen to get him on board. He's given that safety net to Josh Allen really in the passing game, and they've been rolling over teams. So I think it's going to be a big ask for the Colts. And like I said, that Darius Leonard-led defense to slow them down.
I think it's a really interesting matchup because I think, as you said, the Colts, in a different kind of run of games on Sunday could have found themselves outside looking in and not making the playoffs at all. But the AFC just feels so stacked that you kind of look at teams like the Colts and think, well, look, if they were rolling out as one of the teams on Super Bowl Sunday, you wouldn't be that surprised. There's an awful lot of things they've got going for them. And I think you mentioned, Leonard and the defense being such a big thing. But I think one of the other storylines for the Colts is the resurgence of T.Y. Hilton. And just the fact that, if this turns into a shootout 3 or 4 weeks ago, I'm not sure I'd have seen the Colts keeping pace. But all of a sudden, this is a game that could go in a whole host of different directions. I
think the Colts' run game has really opened things up, and Jonathan Taylor's been a big part of that. Since the Colts bye, he has been I expected him to be certainly in the final game running 250 yards to take the Colts into the playoffs was impressive. I think behind that offensive line, he's got a real chance to put some points up against the Bills. And I think, like you say, if they can keep pace with them, then that will be the way that they do it. I certainly think the Colts defense is capable of slowing the Bills. So it's going to be very much a case of that Colts offense. And like you say, T.Y. Hilton and Josh Allen kind of going head to head. So it'll be interesting.
Colts, it's more going to be about the run game. I think, as you said, Taylor over the whole season really, but certainly, I've really noticed him over the last kind of 4 or 5 weeks has really come to the fore. So I think that's where, if the Colts are going to win this game, I think it's their run game that's going to win the game for them. I think their offense through the air is okay. I wouldn't say it's, out of all of the where are we, 14 playoff teams, I wouldn't say it's in the top, probably not in the top 10 in my opinion. But I think that run game, has really got going over the last few weeks. And I think that's what will take you to the win.
See, I disagree, Aldrin, when you started your bit by talking about how the Colts kind of snuck into the playoffs. I disagree. I think the Colts have been, for a chunk of this season, a vastly superior team in terms of a lot in the AFC. And yeah, they made it in because the Dolphins lost, but you can't look at the Colts and say, oh, they don't deserve to be here in comparison to like the Bears, the football team as examples from the NFC. I think Phil's point around the potency of the air attack for the Colts has got some validity to it, but I think saying they're not top 10 out of the 14 that are there, I think is downplaying Rivers. I think he struggled at first, and for me, it definitely looked like those early Colts Rivers games were very much like, okay, so were the Colts, was the Chargers the problem rather, or was it Rivers who was the problem? And it's Rivers why they kept losing those close games. But then I think as he's got settled with Frank Reich, who I think is a fantastic coach, I think you can see the quality showing.
I think that's a really good point, to be fair. I think I did perhaps downplay the way in which the Colts got in. I think if you think 2 weeks ago, bar a bit of a second half collapse against the Steelers, the Colts would have been charging towards the playoffs with a significantly better win run. So I think, yeah, you're right. It's a good point.
But I think you're looking at two coaches, really, who you'd probably say have had absolutely stellar seasons. And to think what Frank Reich is able to do with the Colts and those pieces and how he puts them together, I think, there's far stranger things than the Colts or for that matter, the Bills getting hot and finding themselves in a Super Bowl.
Frank Reich landing with the Colts after the Colts got binned off by Josh McDaniel is potentially the luckiest thing that's happened to the Colts. You talk about getting the number one pick and coming across Andrew Luck. You talk about the kind of the safety net they had with Jacoby Brissett, getting Rivers, who can still throw it and can still do what you need him to do, is great. But I think Frank Reich is just that piece that I think keeps the Colts going.
Yeah, I would agree. He's a great coach and he's done wonders for the team. So, yeah.
So, Aldrin, this was your game. You kicked us off with your pick of the week. So, of the Bills and the Colts.
I'm going to put the Bills into Club Dub this week. I can't see past them.
So Josh Allen and the Bills are our first team on our first podcast who find themselves into Club Dub. An awful lot going on both sides of the ball there and a great game to look forward to. But with the Bills in Club Dub, let's move on to our second game of the week. And I'm throwing over to you, PB.
The Buccaneers, Tampa Bay versus the Washington football team. So a 13-year playoff drought over for the Buccaneers. Fans are celebrating on both sides of the pond. And I know a lot of people are saying that this is a favourable matchup for the Bucs, but actually I think it's probably going to be a tougher game than people give Washington credit for. I don't necessarily see the Bucs walking in and storming the Capitol. Now, it's as close to a fairy tale or Hollywood team as you're going to get with Washington, with Coach Rivera beating cancer, taking IVs at halftime to make sure that he can have his treatment and continue coaching the team. And of course, you've got Alex Smith at quarterback, who, any other season in a normal season would be the story of the season. He's unquestionably comeback player of the year. He's done an amazing job with them, to be honest. I think Bruce Arians has said this week, every time Alex Smith has played, Washington have gone 4-1 and had a +3 turnover margin. So it's a different team when they've got Alex Smith playing. And we're playing that 4-1 team, assuming he does play, not that 7-9 team. So I think that's going to be, a big deal for them. It's going to be built around their passing offense. Our secondary has been a bit shaky at times this season, the Bucs secondary. So, that's going to be an interesting one to watch. On the Bucs side of the ball, they're going to be without Devin White again. It's too early for him to come off the COVID list, so he's obviously going to be a big loss in the linebacker position next to Levante David. But Kevin Minter deputised there against the Falcons last week, had a solid game, so hopefully he can put up another strong showing. Shaq Barrett is back from the COVID list, which is a big boost to our pass rush. It's a big part of our game when we get the D going on the pass rush. Jason Pierre-Paul on the other side of the line. He's been held out of practice a couple of days due to his knee, so that's one to watch. But again, if we've got Pierre-Paul one side and Shaq Barrett the other side, I think, Alex Smith is going to be in for a tough night. On the injury side of things, Mike Evans, we all saw him go down in week 17 and looked like a really nasty one. He practiced today, so he's going to be a game time decision, but I'd expect to see him in some sort of limited capacity. And, hopefully for the Bucs, they'll probably want to get up early and get him out of the game to rest up a bit. And then Carlton Davis as well, one of our cornerbacks. He's going to be a game time decision as well. So, our secondary, as I've said earlier, has been a bit weak. So I think that's going to be an interesting one to watch. But, this really looks like a different Bucs team over the last 3 or 4 weeks, especially on offense. The team appears to be clicking a bit more. Antonio Brown's hitting his stride. He's got touchdowns in 3 straight games. And if it becomes a shootout, I expect the Bucs to have too much firepower for the football team. But I think it's going to come down to a game of the Bucs offense versus the Washington D that's really going to decide the game. Chase Young, everybody's been talking about him this season. He's been the standout player for Washington. Everybody saw him running off the pitch last week saying he wants Tom Brady. That's going to be the storyline going into the game. And I'd expect him to try and take advantage of the matchup versus Donovan Smith at left tackle. I think that's a favourable matchup for Chase Young. So it's going to be interesting to see how often they can get to Brady.
Oh, no, I was going to say, so for me, chipping in first, I think there's kind of a number of ways to read these storylines, isn't there? But let's start with Washington, as you did. Even though they come out of a historically poor division, and if you're an Eagles fan, if you're an Eagles player or coach, probably similar with the Giants or Cowboys, you go into this offseason with huge, huge questions to answer in key areas of your organizations. But Washington, even without making the playoffs, even with this record, is a massive turnaround. Ron Rivera's done a brilliant job. Alex Smith, like you say, as comeback player of the year, should be an absolute shoo-in. And I think even if, and I probably do expect, Washington's season to end this weekend, I think a lot of people can really start thinking about what a great turnaround they've had this year and how that carries through to next season. All of that said for Washington, I think you've kind of summed up for me the Achilles heel. And for me, it's just a matchup of styles that doesn't work well for them. I think the Bucs have the ability to put up points quickly, put them up in bunches on the offensive side of the ball. If Brady doesn't, become the legendary Brady in the playoffs, I'd be surprised with all of the kind of form and all of the firepower he's got. But it's more that Alex Smith question. You have got so much pressure you can put on a quarterback on the Bucs side of the ball, and you have got a very stationary quarterback in Alex Smith. And I can just see this being the kind of game where Washington put up 10 or 17 points and the kind of game where the Buccaneers could probably double that. And I think for me, even if it is straightforward, let's not lose sight of the fact it has been a very, very unexpected season for Washington.
Brady, it's a good point. And when he puts up 20 points or more, I think his playoff win percentage is, far and away what it is if they put, below 20 points on. And I can't see the Bucs not putting 20 points up against this Washington D. I mentioned Chase Young. I think, just to touch on my key players of the game, I think it is Chase Young for the football team. And for the Bucs, maybe a bit of a surprise, I'd probably pick Ronald Jones. There's no doubt Chris Godwin's going to be big. We saw that after Evans went down in week 17. Godwin really stepped up to the plate. But the Bucs have struggled in games where they haven't established the run this season. And I think that's the key to getting the offense going, getting the run game going, getting some play action in the plays that are called. And I think Ronald Jones is going to be a big part of that. He's back, to some level of fitness now after having COVID and his broken finger. So I think that is going to be interesting.
You are correct, I think, in your assessment of Alex Smith as comeback player of the year. And I don't think anyone will argue that point. I do think what a lot of people seem to forget is as good as the Chiefs are now with Patrick Mahomes, and I will pin my flag to the mast that Patrick Mahomes is the best quarterback in the league right now. The Mahomes' rookie year, when he was sat behind Smith, the Chiefs were just as good. Alex Smith was running that offense efficiently, effectively. They were putting up points, and Smith was picking things up with his legs. The problem came from the fact that his first season with Washington was obviously when he suffered his horrible injury. And it's going to take a while to recover from that, not least in a team that is not the Chiefs. The football team have got promise. You said we've talked about Chase Young. We've talked, I think, a bit about Terry McLaurin. people like that, they're the foundations that you can build around. I don't think it's the football team's time though, because I think if you look at the Bucks have that Hydra offense. You know, you cut off one head of the Hydra and another two take its place. So with the Bucks, you double cover Mike Evans, who's going to pick up Chris Godwin. You double cover Chris Godwin, who's going to pick up Antonio Brown or Rob Gronkowski, or even sort of your Scotty Millers. I think with someone like Brady, who is so intelligent with where he distributes the ball, I think the football team, to me, have got to be absolutely on the ball and absolutely playing out of their skins.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point that Rob made about it's just an unfavourable matchup for Washington, and I think that's a really key thing. Where Washington have done really well this year is getting Antonio Gibson rolling, and when he's got that ground game going, they've been able to put up some points and get the offense moving down the field. I think Tampa does such a good job of stopping the run that cuts off one of their best outlets for points. I think on the other side of the ball, I know we've kind of talked Chase Young to death, but I think that really is going to be the key for Washington, is getting pressure on Tom Brady over his career. That's his only weakness. It's the weakness of all quarterbacks, really, is when you get pressure in their face. And I think Washington have done that really successfully against a lot of quarterbacks this year. So the key for me is players like Chase Young, Darren Payne, getting at Tom Brady. And if they can slow that down, then they give themselves a chance. But I think you're right, Alex Smith's immobility, and realistically, just this year, he's not been putting up big passing numbers, and I think that's going to slow them down. That's the weakness of the Tampa Bay team, is that secondary. And if they're not pushing the ball downfield, then for me, that's where they're going to miss those opportunities that other teams have taken against Tampa this year. So, personally, I can't see beyond Tampa, but I do think it'll be closer than it might be expected to be. I think.
So a few different opinions. I'm probably the one sitting here thinking the Buccaneers could win this game by 30 clear points. Maybe I'm on my own there. But Phil, it was your game, so I hand back to you to say.
I think they're going to be firing the cannons and celebrating on Saturday night our time. And I'm going to have to put the Bucs in club dub.
Nice. 2 games down, which means of our feature games this week, 2 games to go, and it rolls round to me next. And for my game of the week, I have picked one of the games that I think probably doesn't scream game of the season, but I think there are so many storylines intertwined with it. I've gone for Bears against Saints. The Bears and the Saints matchup for me is just fascinating, because I think this one game is going to define seasons and perhaps be the, exclamation point on careers. So let's kind of start on what I think is probably the weaker side of this matchup, and let's start in Chicago. So the Chicago Bears, if you talk about roller coaster seasons, have probably redefined what that could be. If ever a team struggled to 5-1, it was the Bears. And then you had that absolute slump in the middle of the season. Matt Nagy gives up play calling. All of a sudden, Bill Lazor's taking over, as the offensive coordinator calling the plays. And you see this slight renaissance. And I think there's been a bit of a misunderstanding to that narrative, because you kind of hear a lot of people talk about the upturn in form since the Bears went back to Mitchell Trubisky as their starting quarterback. But for me, Mitch's numbers, you've only got to look at Football Outsiders, Pro Football Focus, are not particularly spectacular in this kind of final third of the season, where the Bears have kind of, more often than not found themselves back to winning ways. But what you've got is Bill Lazor able to do something with what was a really stagnant run game. Now, the reason I think the narrative here is so interesting is if we imagine a Bears win on Sunday, you are looking at a team that started 5-1, that found their way into the playoffs and won a playoff game. For the roster, for the talent that this team has, that can only be a success. If they lose this game, there are question marks around the quarterback, if not quarterbacks. And certainly when your backup quarterback is promised the kind of money that Nick Foles is contracted for, that's not only a problem for now, it's a problem you could carry into the future. You then kind of look at the fact that, Matt Nagy, probably 2/3 of the way through the season, looked like a coach on the hot seat. Is it enough to say that it will be the same coaching setup and the same philosophy going into next year? And that, I think, is probably the less dramatic of the two storylines, because if you flip over to the Saints have felt like the epitome of a win-now franchise for probably the last 5 or 6 years. We're now looking, you clear a decade until you go back to Drew Brees winning his Super Bowl in New Orleans. And you now look at this as, well, is it the final season? And I don't necessarily mean, is it the final season with Brees? Does he retire? I mean, have we seen anything from Brees this year that means that if they don't make it this time around with all of the salary cap problems they've got going into next season, that Brees could bring another team back to the playoffs? I'm not sure the arm strength or any of that is quite there to put him up against the very best the league has to offer, or even the conference has to offer, if we think about the NFC. So looking at the Saints, this is a team that I think is stacked. This is a team that I think absolutely has what you need this time round in a season so affected by COVID to go and win big. I mean, we talked with Frank Reich earlier about the importance of coaching. I think Sean Payton is arguably the NFL's best coach. I think you'd put people up and around, but I wouldn't see anybody head and shoulders above him. And I think for me, on the one hand, you go, well, the Saints are there, the Saints are ready. And I think if they lose on Sunday, all of that goes away. I think this is absolutely their best opportunity, not only now, but for a good number of years ahead, to go and get that second Super Bowl title. And I think anything less than that for the Saints would just be utterly crushing.
There are multiple things to talk about with the Saints, and I'll get back to this. I think to talk about the Bears first, I think the Bears are maybe, looking at the field, the most sort of Jekyll and Hyde team that's made it into the playoffs. I think you have got a team that from week to week and even quarter to quarter have swung so wildly from either end of the scale in terms of performance that you've got to ask yourself how much of the game is just going to be affected by which Bears turn up. I think for as much as at the beginning of the season with getting benched to put in my boy, Nick Foles, Mitchell Trubisky has probably done enough to get another look in Chicago. Not kind of the multi-million-dollar contract that you normally see for a first-round quarterback. But I think he's probably done enough to come back maybe one more go and see what they do. I agree with your point on the Saints, though. And I think in much the same way that it was always Brady and Manning, it's now Brady and Breeze, because they are the two old men of the division. Again, no disrespect to old man Rivers. The difference is Brady is consistent and on the field week after week, year after year. This is the second or third straight season where Breeze has missed a chunk of time with an injury. And I think we talk about his arm strength. I think this is probably Breeze's last ride. And I think, the Saints are probably going all in to have him go out on top like Manning did.
Well, to be fair, you both made really interesting points, particularly around Breeze. I think he is one of those quarterbacks that feels like he's trying to get into that Super Bowl for the last 2 or 3 years on his last legs and hope that he can bring the team back from the brink and get them into the deep into the playoffs. I think obviously these teams played against each other early in the season. It was a real close game. It was like 23-26, I think, to the Saints. And for me, I kind of feel like we've probably got another of those games coming up this weekend. I think it could be really close. I think the key will be the health of the Saints' best players. I think Michael Thomas has been on and off IR this year. Same with Breeze. I kind of get the impression that they've been saving Thomas for the playoffs, knowing how crucial he is to that offense. So for me, he's the player to watch, really. He can put up points like nobody's business and yards, and I think that's going to be crucial. Breeze is predominantly working on short routes and slants and plays like that. So if they can get Alvin Kamara in the game, if they can get Michael Thomas rolling, then the Saints should have enough to get past what for me is a bit of a stagnant Bears offense. I think they've done really well in the last few weeks, but I feel predominantly that's been led by the run game and David Montgomery. But the flip side of that is they've had good matchups for running backs over the past 3, 4, 5 games, and I think that will probably stop against the Saints. And if the Saints can stop that run, then I think what any team wants to do is make Mitch Trubisky throw the ball, isn't it? So I think if they can get him doing that, then they give themselves a real fighting chance with, Marshawn Lattimore in the backfield and what have you. So,
yeah, no, just a quick one on the back of JB and Aldrin's point. The funny thing is, you talk about the Bears and you go, I could see the Bears winning this in a close one. But the funny thing is, the point you made, JB, about which Bears turn up is so relevant. I mean, I could pick the Lions, I could pick the Jaguars, I could pick the Jets, I could pick, and you could imagine the Bears only beating them in a close one. It's one of those weird teams that you just can't imagine the Bears grabbing anybody by the scruff of the neck, can you? But I
don't think the Bears should even be in the playoffs. They lucked out to a win against the Buccaneers earlier in the season. I think the Cardinals were a better team. So, I think the Bears probably, on balance, would be happy just to have made the playoffs. I can't really see them doing a lot of damage to the Saints as much as I would love them to. But I think Aldrin's point is key. That it's the how fit, how healthy are the Saints' key players. Alvin Kamara may make the game. I haven't seen confirmation either way. And if he's late off the COVID list, has no practice, with a week or 2 weeks rest, how's that going to be for him? Will that be good? Will he be a bit rusty? And he is their offense, I think. Breeze, everybody said at the start of the season, Brady's washed, not going to do well in Tampa. But actually, I think he's shown he's had, one of his best seasons of his career. Breeze, I just don't think he's got it anymore. I think this is his last season. This could be his last game if the Bears win. And I think it's just going to all come down to Kamara and how he can get it going. Michael Thomas has looked great the last couple of seasons, but this year, no one's heard anything of him. There's a lot of fuss about who's the best wide receiver. Well, not him this season. I know he's had a lot of injury trouble, but it's going to come down to those impact players and how they can perform.
Yeah, I think obviously this is my game, so I've now got to make my call and decision. But I think a few interesting points there. The Michael Thomas one, is a real standout one. I mean, we're imagining the Michael Thomas they have in the playoffs is the Michael Thomas we have not seen now for a very long time. I mean, I don't think we've seen even a flash of the old Michael Thomas this season. And whether that's injuries, whether there's something else going on behind the scenes, I don't know. But for all of the talk about Breeze not quite having what he used to have and so on, let's say this. I mean, Sean Payton, I think, could probably win with any quarterback or any backup quarterback in the league. I think as a coach, he is that good. He game plans so well. His teams are so aggressive and so motivated. And also, if Breeze is not the player he once was, I think it's just worth mentioning that we are talking about one of the greatest of all time. We would love him to win a second Super Bowl for those of us who follow the sport. But, I mean, he's won one. I mean, we could talk about the Marinos of this world, the superstar quarterbacks who never won the big one at all. But for me, an 80% Breeze is still a hell of a lot better than a lot of other QBs out there. So for me, my choice for Club Dub is going to be the Saints. I know that you guys have all had your picks as well, and these will all go out on our Twitter account. But incredible for me to see that not everyone in our little foursome here picked the Saints to win that. So there's obviously a bit of doubt amongst the group. But yeah, to be clear, the team I'm putting into Club Dub is going to be the New Orleans Saints. So we mentioned earlier teams in the Chicago Bears that are just happy to be in the playoffs. Well, famously, one of the teams in our next feature game was so happy to be in the playoffs, they had T-shirts made. and good for them. I'm handing over to you, JB.
How could it be anything but the Cleveland Browns at the Pittsburgh Steelers? And I'm coming into this a little bit disappointed because I was quite excited for this game. I think something like a division game 3 times in a season is quite special. And as we've gone through the regular season, I think I've been a lot higher on the Browns, Baker Mayfield and some of their component parts than several of my colleagues here on this podcast. And I feel like the Corona situation has taken a little bit of that excitement away with Stefanski not in there to call plays. I think that's going to affect the Browns incredibly. And I don't think it's going to be those same regular season Browns that we see. That's not my Browns point, though, and I'll come back to that. The consideration that I've got for the Pittsburgh Steelers is whether they've solved the offensive woes or not. I have absolutely no concerns over the defense. I think led by Stephon Tuitt, Cameron Hayward, Defensive Player of the Year, TJ Watt, because how can it be anybody but him?
Wow.
Is incredible. I've got no doubts with them. The comeback against the Colts needs to show whether it was them putting the right pieces in place, Deontay Johnson kind of recovering from the slump he'd been in, Big Ben distributing the ball and going deeper quite a few times and kind of feeling like that old, like 2014, 2015, 2016 Steelers? Or was it a false dawn of a team that felt they just needed to give this little bit to get over the hump and back into the game? And when we get to Sunday, they'll kind of slump back to what they were again. If they do, I worry that they will give the Browns the opportunity to stay in the game, because with the Browns driving behind a combination of Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt, they're very difficult to stop, as we saw with the game in Week 17. The consideration that I have around the Browns is coming as a question really to the group for discussion. And it's the simple fact of, if the Browns don't win on Sunday, is the season still a success?
So if I answer your question first and then we'll roll around the group, then I'm going to say yes. I mean, these guys made T-shirts. I mean, when you take on a coach like Kevin Stefanski, who was not one of the fancied names, not one of the famed coordinators, not one of the most in-demand candidates, he came into a pretty dysfunctional organization. But an organization that's been dysfunctional for so long, where was the root cause of that? How far back do you go to diagnose that problem? So is it a successful season? Yes. I mean, undoubtedly a successful season. I have no doubt about that at all. Just their win-loss record, I think, is as good as it's been in the best part of 20 years. Now, the part you mentioned about their chances on Sunday and them being tied to Kevin Stefanski, I think I've obviously been big already on Frank Reich, Sean Payton, throughout our chat about the importance of coaches this year, particularly in a COVID-disrupted season, and what a difference they can make. I think the Stefanski issue is more of a Baker Mayfield Stefanski issue. I think although Cleveland are absolutely propped up would be the wrong phrase, they lead with what is a great 1-2 punch at running back. Baker Mayfield is like the emotional barometer for that team. When he's up, when he's big, when he's having those Kirk Cousin types moments, when he's shouting on the sideline and slapping backs, you feel like that side has an awful lot of belief and a lot of momentum. When he's off, whatever else the Browns have to rely on, both offensively and defensively, you feel like they lose something without Baker's sparkle. So just how well Baker will manage without Stefanski, I think is probably, for me, distilling that challenge. But in terms of, this game, you made the point, and my point coming round to the Steelers is a far quicker one. How good are the Steelers? There was a lot of, questions about, were they one of the more average unbeaten teams heading through November that we've seen? And, for all of the response from Steelers fans that was a bit unfair, well, they haven't necessarily proved those doubters wrong with the way the season ended. Feel good is big in the playoffs.
And I think the thing is, the Browns probably go in with feel good. I think if the Steelers come out with a win, they go into the next round with feel good. And I think either of these teams with a bit of swagger.
100% it's a successful season for the Browns. I think they haven't got there in, 12 years? 12, more than 12? I think they would take getting into the playoffs any day of the week. And on balance, I think they certainly deserve to be there. Like you said, that 1-2 punch at running back is impressive. I think that is definitely going to be one of the areas that they're going to look to try and exploit against the Steelers. I think Steelers have been good against the run, but we saw in the Colts game, Jonathan Taylor ran through them for 2 touchdowns and 75 odd yards. And that's happened a few times recently. So I think the Steelers can be got at running back, and that obviously plays massively into the Browns' hands. The Steelers, I think that point of how good are the Steelers, I think we've yet to see. The Colts game, for me, didn't answer enough of those questions. That first half was decidedly abject. They didn't look in it. Yeah, they came back and got the win, but I think as much as anything, that was their defense, not their offense. So it is going to be crucial for me, the likes of Deontay Johnson, and has he got over all those drops? Juju answering those questions about all of his TikTok dances and, focusing on playing and getting points on the board for his team. So I think it's going to be a really interesting one, but I do think the Steelers will have more than enough. Ben with a week off towards the end of the season, and just his experience, I think, helps put them over the line here.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think all of you are, to be honest. I think the Browns will be happy. If you'd given them a playoff spot at the start of the season and said, this is a successful season for you, I think they'd have taken it. I think from the Steelers, and going back to your point, Rob, on how good they are, I think their record was padded. Sorry, James. In terms of how good they were at the start of the season, I think they went through a shaky few weeks and have recovered. But I think this is a favourable matchup for the Steelers. I think if you could have taken any of the other 5 teams and said, who would you rather play, they would have picked the Browns. I think if you look at some of the other teams there in the AFC, they would have been a much tougher matchup. So I think it's a good matchup for the Steelers. I think the Browns will be happy to have got through the season. They're going to miss some players and the head coach through COVID, which is a shame going into the playoffs. But, that was always going to be a risk. But, yeah, I think this is nailed on for a Steelers win.
So, JB, I'm going to throw it back to you. I mean, firstly, I think we seem as a group to be answering a Brown season with double-digit wins is definitely a success, whatever happens next. I don't know, I wouldn't want to be you picking a winner in this game. I know there's probably a slight amount of Steelers biased in there. But for me, the weird thing is the Browns losing to the Ravens the other week is probably the best offensive performance of the Browns season. And if they can run a team like the Ravens close at the moment, arguably they can run anybody close. But over to you, JB. Who is it you're going to put in? This was the
game that I have gone back and forth over in my head. I have stumped for a Steelers win because I think, to go to Rob's point, I think Baker Mayfield is going to miss Stefanski. Not at first, not maybe for the first quarter because of the scripting, but when you get into sort of quarter 2 and quarter 3, when you need to start calling plays to go along with the game, I think that's where Mayfield might start to suffer. And I can't, in good conscience, pick against a team who have a 72-73 game streak of at least 1 sack. I think TJ Watt will get home, and I think that'll be the change.
So the Steelers find themselves in Club Dub. So with those, we've got our 4 picks to go into Club Dub from our 4 games of the week, which means that there is 1 Saturday tie and 1 Sunday tie that I want to throw out to the group and get your thoughts. And let's go chronologically, shall we? So on Saturday, we see the NFC West tie of the Rams against the Seahawks.
McVay, coaching the Rams, has the hoodoo over the Cardinals, but he's not beaten the Seahawks. Is that right?
Yeah, the NFC West is a weird division because a lot of people believe the Cardinals have the hoodoo over the 49ers, the Rams have the hoodoo over the Cardinals, the Seahawks over the Rams, and so on. Absolutely
too
right.
much of the Rams. I think, the Rams were missing a few parts last week that they're going to get back this week. Cooper Kupp is going to be back, and he's obviously a big part of their offense. They may have Jared Goff back, but Jared Goff hasn't had a great season, and adding a broken thumb or whatever it was into that, that's going to affect his throwing action. Do they stick with, is it Wilford that they had last week? The guy that, no one had heard of, and he turns up and he gets them into the playoffs. It's a tricky one, but I can't see anything but a Seahawks win here.
I've got to disagree with you on that. I think Sean McVay schemes that team so well, and that defense that the Rams possess is fierce. So I can see DK Metcalf getting locked down by Ramsey. I can see Donald getting at Wilson, and I can see so much creativity on that offense that the Rams might just have enough for the Seahawks, who've been a bit poor against the run. I think we'll have Cam Akers back for the Rams, and that will make a real big difference to their ability to put up points. So, yeah, I'm going to have to disagree with you. I'm going to pitch a Rams win for this one.
See, I am in agreement with Phil, so I disagree with you. I've gone for the Seahawks as well. Seahawks football is, win enough games to get into the playoffs, and then Seahawks football changes to something else. And we, I think, have let, again, a bit of a slump in performance get away from Russell Wilson being an MVP candidate at the beginning of the season. Hashtag let Russ cook was a thing for a reason. And I think what Russ is going to cook up is a win for the Seahawks.
Do you know what? I think it's a coin flip game. I think, having seen both pretty close up this season, being a Cardinals fan, I mean, Russell Wilson is just remarkable. I just love watching the guy play, and I think Pete Carroll, again, will have his team really well prepared. I just can't call this one at all. It wouldn't surprise me if it was the Rams, wouldn't surprise me if it was the Seahawks. But despite a bit of inconsistency, God, we're only a few weeks away, or a few weeks removed, should I say, from the Rams losing to the Jets. I could again see any of these teams going pretty deep. I think they're pretty much made for the big game and for the big occasion. So, but yeah, what a close game, and what a really good one to watch. Looking forward to it. So we end with nobody's game of the week, but arguably, I think probably one of the more interesting ones. If it wasn't for certain allegiances we have as podcasters, this one could have come out of the hat pretty early. So I'm going to throw out to you guys in a sec Ravens and Titans, but let me throw a few little storylines your way before I do. The Titans went into the playoffs last season as that really kind of that team with a bit of momentum, a bit of spark, and a bit of something about them at the right time. That almost unstoppable run game. Tannehill, finding levels that a lot of people never imagined he could play at. And they were able to roll over a couple of very good teams, including, of course, the Ravens, who, although it kind of got forgotten, in all the furore about Mahomes and what was done by the Chiefs in the Super Bowl, were kind of the team that most people were picking going into playoff football to get themselves a Lombardi trophy. Now, what I think makes this game so interesting is, although the Titans' run game is still absolutely unstoppable and Tannehill has had, another very solid, if not better than solid year, I feel like the tables have turned. They look like the kind of team who are ready to take on anybody. And when you talk about them on offense, whether it's run, whether it's throw, so much of it goes through Lamar Jackson. And when he is playing well, they are organized enough and nasty enough on defense to make them dangerous for anybody. So in terms of Ravens and Titans, close enough maybe again to be another coin flip game.
Like you pointed out, the Titans came on such a high last year, and they were in such good form, and they were steamrolling teams, and that carried through to that Ravens game. I don't really feel like the Titans are there like they were last year. They kind of stumbled past the Texans almost in the final game of the season, and albeit I think part of that was game plan to get Derrick Henry to his 2,000 rushing yards, which obviously was phenomenal. But I think it's a really good point. It could be a coin flip game, and I think the one thing that tips it for me is that resurgence of Lamar Jackson over the last few weeks. Not only in, obviously, we know about his athleticism and his dynamic playmaking ability to take off and run at any moment, but I think they've got Hollywood Brown involved in the passing game in the last few weeks. And for periods of the early start of the season, he looked invisible to Lamar Jackson, but now they've really got him seeing a lot more targets in the game and putting up a lot more yards. I think Mark Andrews is that safety net that every quarterback wants at tight end. The Ravens will have enough. I think it's going to be a real close matchup and it goes to the Ravens, but like you say, toss of a coin, it could be anybody in that game.
I think, on paper, I think the Titans would have this one. I think they've proved they're a stronger team over the season. I don't think the Ravens have been particularly brilliant this year, but I think, we all remember in the last regular season game between the two of them, the Titans were dancing on the Ravens logo and there were the arguments amongst the coaches. And I just think these are two teams that really don't like each other. And the Ravens are sick of kind of being bullied and messed around by the Titans. So I can see the Ravens being really up for this one. It's a real toss-up. This, I think, is probably the one game out of all six that I think is really going to be hardest to pick the winner. And I think it's going to be a really good game to watch.
I suppose I'm the outlier because I think of the four of us, I'm the one that's going with the Titans here. The Titans, as they showed last year in almost the exact same situation in the playoffs, know they have the recipe to beat the Ravens. I think Tannehill is showing that last year wasn't a fluke. I think everyone had their doubts about him with his time in Miami, but I think, AJ Brown, Corey Davis are incredible. The Titans, above all of that, have the one offensive player in the NFL that you would take if you had the option, and that's Derrick Henry. And we've talked, like when we've been watching Red Zone together, that Derrick Henry has that like Joe Diesel Riggs quality of just getting stronger as the games go on. I can't see after a 2,000 yard season, this game going any way than just Henry just wearing down the Ravens. And then in that fourth quarter, pulling off what are one of, I think, his traditional massive runs to really seal the game away.
And there you have it. Great work, guys. All the detail that any fan could need to break down the six ties for this weekend's NFL Wildcard Round. If you find your way over to our Twitter page, you can see all of our predictions for all of this week's games and, of course, leave your own. But do join us next week, where we'll not only review this round of games, but give predictions for the next round as we get ever closer to that Super Bowl that we're hoping is now less than a month away. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll catch up with you all again next week.
This is amazing.
Remember to subscribe and be cool. Tell your friends.